Okay, I'm Suzanne Jiwani, and I'm going to be presenting on the letters of map amendments and revisions. I work with the Minnesota DNR in the Floodplain Mapping Unit and have worked with letter of map revisions for 40 years, so that's a long time. This presentation is an adaptation from a presentation that we put on with FEMA and FEMA's consulting staff and the staff that are involved with the approval of letter of map changes, so we can know that it's current with what FEMA accepts. We're going to discuss what the different FEMA map amendments and revisions are, and we're going to walk through the submission process and go through some resources. We hope that you get a knowledge of what the LOMAC process and options are and become equipped to ask questions. So you can contact DNR with questions you have on the letter of map change process. We are happy to answer those questions. We just hope you can be more knowledgeable. There are two groups of letter of map changes. There are the letter of map amendments, and which includes the letter of map revisions based on fill, and those are done with an MT1 form. And then there are the letter of map revisions, including the conditional and physical map revision, and those are done with a MT2 form. So here we go. These are the ones that the letter of map amendment. Generally, the MT1s are simple, straightforward cases, and they reflect what's on an effective firm. So you say, this is the flood insurance rate map. This is what we think is inaccurate. But the FEMA does not go and physically change the map. They give people a waiver from having to buy insurance. The MT2 are for the letters of map revisions, and they're more complicated, and they result in a new map. There's a new map that reflects what those technical changes are, and therefore you need to get community acceptance and concurrence on them. So here we see a FEMA map with a special flood hazard area. You have the high risk, the floodway, the low risk, and the medium flood risk area. So if you have a letter of map amendment, FEMA is stating that that structure hasn't been elevated by fill. It was inadvertently shown on the map because of the degree of detail in the topographic information that was used to prepare the FEMA maps. You look at what's the lowest adjacent grade, LAG, lowest adjacent grade, versus the base flood elevation. And what you get is a letter that says, oh, we determined that this should be removed. Here's the address. It should be zone X. Good example here, you have that lowest adjacent grade. It's above the base flood elevation, and that means this structure is out. You can have a basement, but because it's above on the natural ground, for insurance purposes, this is out. However, if you put a deck on, all of a sudden your lowest adjacent grade is the footing of the deck. So now it would be in. And as we've discussed previously, if some of you have been here before, if you can take this deck so it's not attached to the house, so if you put another footing here and had a support so that this was an accessory structure instead of part of the house, then you could get a letter of map amendment. So let's say we have a homeowner and they have a cabin. It's currently shown in the SFHA, and when they look at when the surveyor does the calculation, the property is above the BFE. In that case, you could get a letter of map amendment and have the insurance waived. To do a letter of map amendment, you submit either an MT1 or an MTEZ. If it's only a single lot, you can use either one of these. If it's a multi-lot, you have to use the MT1 form. The MTEZ form is extremely easy, so people should be able to do that. The other documents you need to submit is something that shows either the lowest adjacent grade, or as we will point out, you can have a map that shows that, oh, it's shown as out. Then you don't need to show the lowest adjacent grade. Or you can have a LiDAR. We'll go into those in detail. So there are some exceptions from having to show the lowest adjacent grade. You have to have an estimate of what the base flood, either a knowledge or an estimate of base flood elevation, the recorded deed or plat, and if you're doing meets and bounds instead of just one structure, or you're in an AO zone, which was like where you have overflow instead of just regular riverine flooding, there are some other requirements. There is no fee for FEMA's review of letter of map amendments. You might have the cost of doing the survey, or if you have to pay for your deed plat, you'd have to get that. But you don't have to pay FEMA to review it. And FEMA responds within 60 days. I think their time frame isn't more on 35, but they have in 60 days to respond to it. Now, if you have the house is really high and you can see that you know that it's out, you still are going to have to get a letter of map amendment. We do have some other options on how you can do this without having to pay for the surveyor, but you still have to get a letter of map amendment to get the insurance waived.
Okay, thank you.
One of the requirements for doing this MTEZ form is to say, yes, there's no proper fill that's been put on after the initial flood insurance rate map. So those are usually in the 70s. So if it's an area that was developed in the 50s and people brought in fill, and that was when this structure was built, that counts as not having fill placed on the property. If you have fill placed on the property, you have to use the MT1 form. And the MT1 form is also used for letters of map revision based on fill. And so if you had fill placed on the property after the initial firm date, you would be doing a letter of map revision based on fill, not a letter of map amendment. Here's the building diagram for the letter of map amendment. You have your lowest adjacent grade, you have your bottom floor, you have your next highest floor. You need to say, what is this elevation, the lowest adjacent grade elevation? Or if you're removing the whole property or meets and bounds area, you need to say what is the lowest grade for the part that you want to remove from the insurance requirement. It's necessary to include what the datum is. And yes, you have to check this. I don't know of any areas in Minnesota that are subject to land subsidence or uplift. So if you have a letter of map amendment out as shown, this is one of the cases where you don't have to have a survey to do the lowest adjacent grade. This is an example of the blue is the 100-year floodplain. When they mapped it, this structure is clearly not in the 100-year floodplain. It's actually not in the 500-year floodplain. So you can print this map, or the property owner can print this map and submit it to FEMA, and we'll get a letter of map amendment. We also have found that many times the lending company will accept this map for this property and not require you to go do the paperwork with FEMA for the LOMA. So an example is a company's been paying flood insurance and it's a large lot, and they started doing some work, and when they looked at it, they recognized that, oh, this structure is outside of the floodplain. So he applies for a letter of map amendment out as shown, so he doesn't have to worry about paying for flood insurance for that storage building. So to do a letter of map amendment out as shown, you still need to have the recorded deed plat. You need to have the GIS-based flood map with the property highlighted, but that can be something from the FEMA website. Fermat map. So if you guys have this tax map and you have the Fermat map, you can do the letter of map amendment out as shown, and you don't need to have the survey. Now, a conditional letter of map amendment is a letter stating that a proposed structure that you're not planning to elevate by fill would not be in the 1% floodplain. It is not a building permit. The two cases I have seen this used are when you're in a zone A and you want to make sure that the base flood elevation you're assuming is acceptable to FEMA. Then you could do a conditional letter of map amendment saying this is the BFE that we're going to use. The second is when the property is changing hands and the new owner just wants a little more insurance that what they're doing is going to still not require flood insurance. So this property owner has 5 acres and he's going to build a cabin on a portion of the property, and he believes it's high enough, but on the map it's shown to be in the special flood hazard area. So he wants to make sure that FEMA agrees with him that that land is high enough before he starts to build. Well, to do a conditional letter of map amendment, you need to do an MT1 form. And there is a review fee for doing a conditional letter of map amendment. It's $500 for single, $700 for multiple. You can, when it says multiple, there are several lines on the MT1 form that you can list the different lots. So it can be as many as there are lines. That's how many. There were some cases in Blaine several years ago that had letters of map amendment for 200 structures, and FEMA said, no, 200 structures, we want to change them, revise the map. We want you to do a letter of map revision. One thing to keep in mind is that FEMA does allow for what's called an electronic letter of map amendment, or ELOMA. And what happens is either a licensed surveyor or professional engineer can expedite the LOMA process by applying for it online. So they submit for it online. To do it the first time, the first time a licensed professional does it, it takes the same amount of time because FEMA needs to check. But after that, FEMA pulls some of these to be subject to audit, but in general, you get these approved within a day because FEMA's saying this, we know this is a licensed professional who knows what information to provide us, and they've shown us that they're going to give us accurate information and all the information that we need. So we're going to accept that they did this work right, and then we'll audit a certain percentage of them. And if you get audited, it might take 5 days. So that's instead of the 60 days that FEMA has for the regular submissions for LOMAs. So here the families purchased a home. They know that their neighbor got a LOMA, so they're interested in getting a LOMA too. But they want to know quickly if they're going to be able to have this approved, so they get it go through the LOMA process. It used to be that they only did LOMAs in areas that were detailed study reaches, so AE areas with elevations on the maps. Since FEMA has so many Zone A areas now that have modeling to support them, FEMA will do LOMAs for Zone A areas where they have the modeling. So all of our pink lines, if you know about the pink lines in Minnesota. One of the reasons is that LOMAs have been rejected is because it is in a Zone A area that does not have an established base flood elevation estimate. But that's getting to be less and less in Minnesota. Surprisingly, a lot of people apply for LOMAs and the property already has a LOMA. So an important thing to recognize is LOMAs stay with the property. They are not with the property owner, they're with the property. So if Jim goes and gets a LOMA and he sells the house to Sally, that house, he sells, that LOMA still is there, even though Sally is owning the house. And LOMR-Fs are not eligible for doing LOMAs, only letters of map amendment. And conditional letters are not eligible either. So we're going on to the letter of map revisions based on fill. In these cases, this is a letter from FEMA saying, yes, this house is high enough. It was built by bringing in fill into the floodplain and building it. One of the important things about the letter of map revision based on fill, or LOMR-F, you have to use the MT1 form, and by using the MT1 form, you need to fill this section that is the community acknowledgement. The community acknowledgement is the community saying, no, this isn't in the floodway. This isn't in an area where we're concerned about the Endangered Species Act. They have all of the necessary permits, and the existing and proposed structures will be reasonably safe from flooding. Reasonably safe from flooding means that you're not going to have a basement in the fill. There are some locales that can do basements, but they're very few across the state. And if you think you're an area that allows fill in the basement, be sure to talk to SEAL, and she'll tell you if your community has gotten the appropriate approvals. But I think that's less than 5 communities throughout the state. So in general, you need to get to assure that they're not going to put a basement in the fill.
And even those exemptions, they have to go through things in a certain order. They have to fill the lot, get the LOMR-F, and then go put in the basement. So they're very fussy.
Yes. So usually it's just they shouldn't have a basement. So this is where you sign that. The community is talking about the placement of fill. In general, we don't have floodways in Zone A's. So if you had gone a couple of weeks ago to the Zone A workshop, we went through some of the ways that you can get an estimate of what the floodway is, or else you're going to have to hire an engineer or the property owner is going to have to hire an engineer to know if something in a Zone A is in the floodway. But complying with the Endangered Species Act is just because FEMA got sued many times about allowing fill in areas that were habitat for endangered species, and to get out of all those lawsuits, FEMA just took the liability and pushed it down to the local governments. So, if you want to build plan to build a structure, and if you're figuring out if it's going to be in the floodway, and if it's not in the floodway, then you just make sure that it's built. And in Minnesota, you need to build it above the RFPE. To do a LOMR-F, you have to do an MT1 form, and you're going to have a copy of the effective firm map. You're going to have the plat map. You'll need to have an elevation form showing that everything is above. If it's not in an area without a floodway, you're going to have to describe where the floodway is. And then you do the submittal, and you have to have a fee. So here we have an example. We have a lowest adjacent grade. It got to be that high because they brought in fill. This is okay. An important thing in Minnesota is that there are some state requirements on LOMR-Fs. Basically, getting a LOMR-F removes the insurance requirement, but does not remove the property from the regulated floodplain. So you need to have the fill above the RFPE. It needs to be adjacent to lands that are above the BFE, or has flood control measures that have been constructed. And the community amends the ordinance and adopts the LOMR-F to say, yeah, we allowed this fill and we knew about it. This is an example of a property that cannot get a letter of map amendment or a LOMR-F. Because the ground is below the base flood elevation and no fill has been brought in, you can't get a waiver from the insurance. What you can get is a much cheaper insurance rate because the first floor elevation is quite a bit above the base flood elevation. And they determine insurance rates based a lot on how high above the base flood elevation you are. A conditional letter of map revision is a letter from FEMA stating that a parcel of land or proposed structure would be above if you brought it. It is not a building permit, just like the CLOMA was not a building permit. And then reason people could do this is if FEMA would challenge the floodway or base flood elevation estimates. So here you go. The developer is going to do a project, and since he's going to elevate the lot above the base flood elevation, he does a LOMR-F. Here you need to have an effective firm panel showing the property. You need to have the plat map, you need the elevation form, you need the documentation of the Endangered Species Act. Then you can submit it. And there is a fee. So we can use LiDAR instead of ground survey data for the elevation certificates. Information on this is on the DNR's website. If you want to get into more detail on it. A lot of communities are doing this, but also surveyors. I don't know so many engineers, but surveyors and county GIS departments have been doing it. So this is an example where there is a lake, and you can see here's the extent of what's mapped as the special flood as hazard area. And here is the area that is where the lowest contour on the LiDAR, the 2-foot contour LiDAR, that goes by the structure. But the lowest adjacent grade elevation is 1167, whereas the base flood elevation that's been estimated for this lake is 1140.35. So it's 27 feet off. And what's happened is there's some other area here and they drew a line and it went through this bluff. But you can, if you have all of the information on the map that FEMA requires for doing the LiDAR, you can prepare this and submit it instead of having to get a land survey. As the LiDAR data is getting to be the basis for delineations, there's less need for this. But for areas that have paper maps right now, or areas whose maps were prepared, digital maps were prepared early enough in the process that they weren't using LiDAR to do the delineation that's on their digital flood insurance rate map, this can be a very cost-saving approach, an option for your homeowners. Now here's another example. The base flood elevation is 1140.35, and this house is above 1150. The counties sometimes have better maps for showing, especially for the outage shown, because they have better aerial photography, and they can be accepted by the lenders, often are accepted by the lenders for documentation. Some lenders might want something from FEMA, but in that case, you can use the letter of map amendment out as shown. And there are a couple of counties who have prepared special sites to help with the LOMA process, and can use those to determine where the LiDAR is in comparison to where the floodplain delineation, FEMA floodplain delineation is. So this
hey, Suzanne,
yeah.
A question about, the question was asked, is it standard to subtract 1 foot from the LiDAR to determine the lowest adjacent grade determination? Could you speak to that?
Well, okay. You have the lowest adjacent grade, and FEMA is saying that is the accuracy of that is plus or minus a foot because it's a 2-foot contour. So you either subtract a foot and say that the house is a foot lower than what it shows on the contour, or you say I'm comparing it to a base flood elevation that's got a 1 foot of buffer. But you are right, that is accurate, that you're looking for something where you have a buffer between the base flood elevation and the lowest contour of 1 foot. So it had.
I'll just add that I know on our LFEO maps, our lake and flood elevations online viewer maps in the comments, what the FEMA lead reviewer told me was acceptable was to say LiDAR lag equals whatever elevation. So taking that 2-foot contour that's not touching and below the house and subtracting a foot, that we can call that the LiDAR lowest adjacent grade.
Okay, well, I didn't ever hear about a LiDAR lag, so I learned something new today. It's good. Always a good day to learn something new. This is the Hennepin County site. I have actually used this site a lot, both for people who call in and have questions, and for friends and relatives who say, I don't know, there's a house, I don't want to know if it's in the floodplain. It's just like, put this address in. We had a question the other day from somebody who was using that flood factor site, and it was, well, that's not going to tell you if it's in the FEMA floodplain map, but this Hennepin County Natural Resources would. So you just enter and you can print the map. They even print it, they can say print a FEMA LOMA map. So it'll meet all of the FEMA requirements for the LiDAR for LOMAs. So it's pointing to the house. It's you've got the base flood elevation and datum is a spot to enter that in on the website. But the panel number is already populated. The contour below the house is noted. So there's a lot of things that get automatically generated in this website. And it is important to recognize that there are 2 types of FEMA floodplain delineations. There's the Zone AEs that are the detailed engineering analysis with base flood elevations on the maps, and the Zone As that are approximate delineations that don't have any BFEs on the maps. It makes it, there's some things that make easy for both of them. There's pluses for both and minuses for both. For the AEs, you're pretty much stuck with that elevation. You have that elevation. You can use it for floodplain management. You can use it for getting these letter of map changes, and it is accepted. That elevation will be accepted if it is on the map. But you can't use a different elevation and say, oh, I know that this elevation is wrong, without going through the letter of map revision process, which we're going to talk about. The zone A's, it requires you to do a little more legwork because it doesn't show you where the floodway is. It doesn't give you the elevation on the map. You're going to have to do a little bit digging to find out what the base flood elevation. But if you have better information, if you have an engineering analysis that shows that this is what the base flood elevation can be for this lot, you can use that if it is signed by a professional engineer. So it's easier to use the zone A's if you are preparing data, and it's easier to use the zone AEs if you're just going to use the FEMA data. One of the big things in Minnesota is most of the areas in Minnesota are A's. We have some AE areas along the major rivers and in some major metropolitan areas. Or like up in Roseau, where there's been a major project that was done by the Corps of Engineers. So if you don't have a base flood elevation, and as I said, if you're in a detailed study area, you just use what's on the map. And if you're in a zone A area, but they're doing an analysis for it and you know what it is because FEMA had some work done, you can use the work that FEMA had done. So several parts of the state have new maps in the process. You can use the information that was generated for those new maps. If you're in a current A zone, you can use the pink lines, the zone A modeling where they're used. Or a common place to go is, was there a letter of map amendment done for a neighbor along the lake? It could be along the whole lake shore. Was there one done for a neighbor, or on a riverine in a nearby stretch of the river? You can use the letter of map, the BFE prepared for that previous letter of map amendment. If it's not on the letter of map amendment form, I'm going to tell you, Sela, I'm going to say contact you, because she can get a hold of the documentation for those LOMAs and find out what they used. However, if it's an area that there is no base flood elevation, no previous LOMA, and they are on a single lot, FEMA will determine the letter or the base flood elevation for a LOMA free of charge. So here we go through. In the newer map modernizations, we have estimated base flood elevations. And most of these are with a simple RAS model, so you can do floodway analyses if you were going to do a letter of map revision based by fill. But the data is not on the map because it's a zone A. We should have provided this information to you. If you as a zoning official do not have this information, please contact us. It's also available on the MinGeo site, and Seal has it on her DNR Lakes and Flood Elevation online viewer site. And this is actually the nicest site. I like this site better than the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer site as far as how it displays it and gives the information. So this is a good site. It has the information that's on the National Flood Hazard Layer, but has added the Zone A cross-sectional data to it. This is what the Zone A cross-sectional data looks like. So you can see here in Polk County, since when you go and download it from MinGeo, we have all of these base flood elevations for Polk County, but we haven't gotten the maps, unfortunately, finalized yet. So we haven't put the updated data on, but we have the pink data, the pink lines on. Whereas in Monoman County, we've gone through it. We have both the new delineations and the pink lines. And this is a sample of what the pink lines look like with aerial. And you can see that there is no floodway here, but it is pretty good for getting the base flood elevations and knowing what base flood elevation to use for this property, 1119.6. This is a map showing where we have data, where we have the blue areas, we have digital data. The pink lines, this is showing you where we have the pink lines. And if you have these blue dots, that means we have some pink line data in those locations. We just haven't gotten it finalized enough to put on our website, but it's very possible that it's finalized enough to provide to you. So please contact us if you're in any of these areas with blue dots or the yellow X's. Who determines a base flood elevation? And the resident should contact the community. The reason we like the resident contacting the community is that you might have better data. We don't know as much about your community as you do. So it's much better to have the resident contact you. And if you don't think you have it, you can contact us. So if you contact online resources and don't find it, contact DNR and we'll work with you to get a BFE estimate. But we'd rather that we gave the BFE estimates to the communities than to citizens. And that is the end of the MT1 forms. Do we have any questions on the ends of the MT1s?
No new questions in the chat.
Okay, so we're going to go on to MT2s. So MT2s are for letter of map revisions. And first thing we're going to talk about is, can you do a revision? Is it something that is allowable? So if it's in a floodway, so if it's an AE area and it's in a floodway, you can't have any structures in a floodway. And if it's allowable as a conditional use because it's a structure like a park shelter that's open on 4 sides, or that's the prime one we talk about as far as allowable structures. We have had some people do some elevating on fill of
bathrooms.
Yeah, bathrooms, restrooms. And
we're talking new structures and additions. Existing ones are allowed to continue to exist
until they get burned down. But there you go.
Or destroyed in some other way.
Yes. So any filling or grading or obstruction in a floodway can't cause any rise. And that's 0.00 feet of rise. So if you're going to have something that's, and if you're going to do something that's filling in the floodway, you either need to obtain a no rise certificate documenting that it doesn't cause any rise, or if it does cause a rise, you need to do a conditional letter of map revision. So as we get a lot of questions on no rises, and a lot of people do no rises, and there's something that comes up because, as we've talked about, let's first do no rises in zone AEs. So if you're in one of these areas that have the elevations on the FEMA map, and we have the floodway on the FEMA map, so we know where the floodway is, we know what the elevation is, you need to do a no rise certification. And this is it goes to the community, because the community is determining that, yeah, they gave me enough information that I know that I accept that it doesn't cause 0.00 feet of rise. If you're concerned that I can't tell if this engineer provided enough documentation, you can contact the DNR floodplain unit and we can assist you in determining if they've provided adequate documentation.
If they've got words like there's not much, or it's insignificant, or other weasel words like that, that's a red flag.
We also get a lot of questions when people say, we're going to do a cut and fill. So if you have, this is the example of what is right there now, and they say, oh, we're going to cut this off and add it over here, and it shouldn't make any difference. Yeah, it will. Now, for one thing, in this case, they have cut something that was above the base flood elevation and they've added it over close to the river. If you even had done something like saying, oh, we're going to cut all of this out and just add this amount in, I would still say that that is insufficient. And that's what I try to explain to some of the engineers who say, I don't need to do a detailed analysis because my cut and fill is adequate. If you're adding fill closer to the river, you're changing the conveyance. You're making the amount of water that the river can handle without increasing in stage. It's going to increase in stage. Now, if you were doing the other thing where you said, oh, right now they have this and we're going to remove it and put it on top of this area that's above the base flood elevation, I would say that's adequate documentation. You have taken something, you've changed your cross section, and the only thing you've changed is to remove something that was an obstruction and elevated above the base flood elevation. That seems like it would be adequate to show that it's not causing a rise. So for letters of map revisions, so if you're not going to get a no rise and you're going to go through the process of revising the maps, you need to provide FEMA with a lot of information because FEMA is going to revise the maps. And so they need to get everything they would need to revise maps. What they'll come back with is saying, this is the area that we revised the map and put in the new SFHA. To do the LOMR, you're going to have to do an MT2 form. The MT2 form has several different forms. So, but the big thing is they have the form that says, here's information about the proper or the area that we're doing it, the community. Here's information on who's paying because there's a lot of fees that need to be processed in MT2s. And then it goes into information on the technical. And they have a different form if you're modifying the hydrology. I think actually hydrology and hydraulics are on the same form. But you have a form for, we're doing hydrology and hydraulics, but if you're putting in a new culvert, there's a separate form you need to fill in. And if you're doing a levee, there's a third form you need to do. And if you're doing channel improvements, there's a form you need to do. So if you're not doing all of those things, you just need to fill out the form that for the type of changes that you're making. A good place to go, we have on the Minnesota DNR website a letter of map change guide, and it talks about the guidance for the letters of map revision. You know, Where is this coming from? Where are these government rules? What do you need to do? What do you need to apply? I would start looking at this if you're doing some work and you're wanting to know a question. So here's an example. If you're building a new construction and you're going to reroute a creek so that it doesn't go through the subdivision, you need to do, in this case, you're going to, oh, I shouldn't say, if where you're rerouting the creek is not currently in the special flood hazard area, you will need to do a conditional letter of map revision. So a good rule of thumb is that if what you do increases the special flood hazard area, either by elevation or by extent, you will need to do a conditional letter of map revision. If this was a wide floodplain and you're rerouting the creek and it's still in the SFHA, then you could do a letter of map revision instead of a CLOMR. When you're submitting a LOMR, you need to fill whatever they tell you on their forms. But this is the fee for FEMA to review it. This is not FEMA doing the analysis. You've had an engineer do the analysis and prepare a lot of documentation to submit to FEMA, and then FEMA is going to charge you to review your engineer's work. And it says FEMA responds within 90 days, but that's, as you notice, a notification of completeness. So usually what happens is they look at it. They have 90 days to look at it, and after 90 days, they send back a letter saying, well, these are the additional things we need. Usually there's only been one case where we didn't have to send more additional information in, and usually they'll give you 90 days to submit additional information. And after you submit it, then they have another 90 days to either evaluate whether it's complete, and once they send you something saying it's complete, they have 90 days to do the evaluation. So there's a lot of 90 days in there, and so it usually takes over a year. So here we are. Conditional letters of map revision are required if the increase in BFE is proposed or the extent of the special flood hazard area is proposed. The difference, and we haven't talked, I think we talk about it, we'll hope we do. The physical map revision, what the difference is. So I would have switched.
We do have a slide later.
Okay. The builder has proposed a river restoration project that would affect the flow of the Midway River and as a result modify the existing regulatory floodway. I would say this is more of an example of where you would do a LOMR, because probably you're modifying the existing floodway, but not really. You could do a letter of map revision and just say, I want the floodway to be this wide, and I'm doing my project within that. But the big thing on CLOMRs is they are required if you are increasing the extent of the special flood hazard area or the base flood elevations. When you're changing the extent of a floodway, I think you can do that with a LOMR and just say, this is my new floodway delineation. Pretty much for a CLOMR, you submit the same things that you do for a LOMR. One of the issues that we have encountered is people who have submitted the CLOMR and then built the project the way they plan to, and then never send the information into FEMA on the completed project. And in their mind, hey, I got my approval for my CLOMR, my project's good to go, but FEMA doesn't change the maps until you submit the information for your letter of map revision. So the maps don't change until you send FEMA as-built information on your project showing that, yes, it was built the way it was designed. One thing that is definitely true though is if you build your project the way it was designed and you have gotten a conditional letter of map revision, the letter of map revision review is much quicker. So that year doesn't take that year anymore.
You might want to comment on flood control projects.
Well, I'm going to comment on here on where fees can be waived. So fees can be waived and not, FEMA won't charge the review fee if you find out that, oh, I needed to do, like a lot of you guys are doing Atlas 14 hydrology. If you had a project that the only change is I didn't put in a new culvert or a new channel rerouting, I just used updated hydrology with Atlas 14. FEMA would revise your maps and not charge you the review fee because that is giving FEMA better data. If you were redelineating because you said, I got new LiDAR data and I know that these are wrong, FEMA would accept that as a redelineation, as a new letter of map revision, and they wouldn't charge you because you didn't do a project. And if you find an error in how the people did the current effective model, then they would waive that fee. However, if you found that error when you were going to do a project, they'll charge you the fee for the project. There is no fee for government-sponsored projects primarily intended for flood use reduction. So we've always promoted to the core, there's no fee for your project. You might as well get your conditional letter of map revision because that will make it much quicker to get the letter of map revision at the end of the project approved. And it would be nice to have that done. A new thing that FEMA added, and it's like in the last 10 years, is if the primary purpose of the project is natural and beneficial uses. And so you have the restorations, dam removals, bank stabilizations, and you can show that, no, this wasn't that this was a road project that we did some stream restoration on. This was a stream restoration project that we had to change a culvert because of our stream restoration. Then you can get the fee waived. A physical map revision is just a letter of map revision for many panels. So FEMA will do letters of map revision for 1 or 2 panels. But if you are ending up doing a county or half a county, they will do a physical map revision. So here's a sample of a letter of map revision that was done. And then we have resources. There are a lot of resources available here. Go to the Flood Map Service Center. If you go there and say search all products, you can find the effective products and the historic products. And you can find any letters of map changes. Those will include both LOMAs and LOMRs. And if you want to look at historic products, that sometimes is helpful, especially with LOMRs. Oh, and a lot of you maybe know that in these letter of map changes, when you have updates, they'll revalidate a lot of your LOMAs. They will put that revalidation letter in under these letter of map changes. So it's just a letter that tells you which things got revalidated. You can go to the MinGeo comment site and you can get information on, the pink lines and the floodways and the base flood elevation lines, all the FEMA data that's available there. You can get the hydraulic models, especially the Zone A models are available from the DNR's FEMA hydraulic download site. Here are some other, we showed you that there was this stuff for the LiDAR for LOMAs, the letter of map change information, the LFEO. We've got a lot of information on the floodplain management webpage. You can go to FEMA and you can get their applications, the online submissions. And here's some other areas that FEMA, the National Flood Hazard Area, Flood Map Changes Viewer. And I actually got it done with 4 minutes to spare, Seal.
I'm very impressed. So I'm going to stop the recording so people can feel more comfortable asking questions. Just take me a second here. Stop recording. Stop.